Good day, colleagues. Hi, Louisa. Great to see you again. Louisa, are you based, whereabouts are you based?
I'm based in Berlin, and hi.
Okay, welcome. And I know it's a banking holiday in some parts of the world. I'm assuming Berlin as well today?
No, it's no holiday today.
Okay, well.
No, yesterday it was, but not today.
Okay. And I see Louisa Mamari is also with us. Hi, Louisa. Great to see you. Welcome back. And Sandor. Marion, welcome.
Hi. We actually have a very long weekend in Nairobi because Friday was declared a public holiday due to late President Kibaki's death a week ago. And
Yes.
Today and tomorrow are public holidays as well. So it's a 5-day long weekend.
Wow. Well, thank you for being with us in spite of that, or in the midst of your holiday. I see Marion's with us, and that it's Eid in your parts of the world. Marion, thank you for being with us over Eid. So, colleagues, we're going to get started here. You'll see that we're at the start of Module 2. Module 2 is actually a very, very important module. It's, from a theory point of view, it's the foundational module. Before we get into the content of the module, let's pause on this interesting image on the screen here at the moment. Any ideas what this might be? Any thoughts on what you might be looking at? Feel free to pop a comment in the chat if you have a sense of what this is, or you want to unmute and give a view. Any thoughts on what you might be looking at? What's interesting about that? What stands out? As you're thinking about that, it is, of course, somewhat of a futuristic image. Louisa saying there, a robot distributing food. Quite right, Louisa. Any thoughts on what what it might be dated as? You know, where it might be from? Michael. Sandor saying Japan, perhaps. So the interesting part is it's a 1983 image from California, Pasadena, California. Of course, using robotics in the context of service. It does look like the person in the restaurant there might be Asian, so it might be an Asian restaurant of sorts. But certainly a weak signal or an early indicator of some technological progress, uses of technology. Maybe one more thought before we move off that image. Any thoughts on what that image in 1983 would have been saying to us about the future of service, the future of business, the future of restaurants? If you were a futurist looking around you in the world of 1983 and you saw that, what would have come to mind for you? Any thoughts either in the chat or if you want to unmute? Michael says there in the chat, automation, absolutely. So we start to see 1983. I mean, if you think back, this is really prior to the internet really being anything to mention at a global scale. Definitely before smartphones and mobile phone apps and online food ordering and driverless drone deliveries of any kind. And so very interesting futuristic image there. As Louisa says, the future of service will be digital and automatic, right? And so this interface between humans and technology, particularly computer technology, becoming a reality. To those who've just joined us, welcome. We're in the very early start here of Module 2. If we go to that next slide, please. What we're going to be looking at in Module 2 is really looking at the nature of change and complexity. So if you look at our roadmap or our learning journey, we're at the very early start of Module 2, exploring futures, and really looking at practical approaches to how we explore futures. You'll see that Module 2 is made up, in fact, of 4 different parts, part A, B, C, and D, where we'll be going through the nature of change and complexity today and how we interact with that, and then looking at drivers of change and systems and alternative futures in part C, and then foresight and everyday practice in part D. So really an action-packed practical session here coming up. I'm very pleased to, in the next slide there, introduce you to a colleague of ours at SWAT, or SOF, Andrew Curry. Andrew comes with a world of experience, having done foresight for multiple organizations, public sector, private sector, civil society all around the world. He's also widely published in the futures field. And so some of our readings would have been written by Andrew in collaboration with other futurists in the field. And so to take us into scoping today, it's great to welcome Andrew Curry. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Marius, for that introduction. And you probably noticed that I haven't got the cool backdrop, which my colleagues have, but that's just technical incompetence on my part. So we're very much talking about scanning for change today. I'm just going to start by putting that into context. Let me just get my... So before we get to scanning, these are the kinds of language that people think about when they talk about the fundamental building blocks of foresight. Drivers of change, systems thinking, alternative futures, sometimes known as scenarios. And you know, drivers of change are those kind of the big sort of directional changes you see going on. Systems thinking are the interconnections between them. Alternative futures, obviously based on the premise that you can't predict the future. You can only identify possible sort of different future paths. Welcome to the people who are just joining. Good to see you. So just looking at that slide and just moving on to the next one, where does scanning fit into this? So just either pop your thoughts in the chat or even just sort of say that. So when we're thinking about, you know, drivers of change, we're thinking about alternative futures, we're thinking about systemic understandings of what's going on. Where does scanning fit into this? Incoming changes, that's very good, Michael. People still coming in, which is all good. Are there other thoughts, or are we going to go with Michael? Michael, do you want to, since you got there first, do you want to speak to that?
Okay, Andrew. Yeah, I think that it's well known that you should be looking as a country in your planning. You should be looking on the horizon to see what new technology, in terms of technology, I work on science, technology, innovation, what new technologies are coming along which could be useful for you or which will affect you positively or negatively, either one or the other. And then you know what you may have to deal with in the coming 2, 5, 10 years, however long it takes for these things to come around to your part of the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right on the money, Michael. Celia, do you want to just, you just put in a comment on the chat, identifying the drivers of change, the pressures on the horizon. Do you want to just expand on that?
Sure. Good afternoon. I mean, I'm just making a wild guess that scanning, we talk about horizon scanning, for example, and trying to look ahead to see what are the possible pressure points that could, you know, influence a system or indeed change a kind of a causal chain of impacts. So my understanding is that scanning would be a kind of an early part of this exercise in which we would try to identify what indeed the drivers of change may be in the future.
Yeah, and that's exactly right too. So I mean, I don't need to spend more time on this, but you know, those three areas, drivers of change, systems thinking, and possible futures are the fundamental building blocks. Scanning actually becomes before all of that. It's actually a foundational part of futures work. It's almost impossible to do futures work without scanning. And just sort of putting it in a little bit of context, and sometimes my computer goes forward. So if we, you know, I think we showed you this 4-stage process last time: scoping, ordering, investigating, and integrating. And, you know, the first part of that's divergent, as you're sort of opening up your understanding and maybe identifying futures landscapes or building scenarios. And then the second part is more convergence, where you look at implications and all that kind of thing. And you know, you look at implications and then you get to action. Scanning's right at the left here. It's kind of, you know, sort of what the things which you're looking at to understand the ways in which the world might diverge. And I just, yeah, Marion's just added a comment in the chat to have a clear picture of what you're attacking, what you're to deal with, shows pros and cons. I think actually scanning's a little bit before that. I think, you know, it's an essential building block to get to that sort of analysis. As we go through the session today, we'll get to that bit, you know, the sort of what you start doing as you start collecting your scan hits. And here's a kind of a sense of what we're doing when we're, and actually Marion's a perfect cue for this slide, so thank you for that. You know, you've got this changing external world around you, and we talk about scanning being an overall sort of 4-stage process that links to the 4-stage process that you talked about. The first is discovery, just actually working out what's going on out there. The second part is recording. I think we've got somebody in the waiting room, Johan, if you want to let them in. The second part is recording. So, you know, you found something, but actually you need to classify it so you can actually find it again later or understand it or get some views on what it might be like. And once you've done that, you get to some sense making. And once you do that, you can start acting. So, you know, Marion sort of summed up that kind of process, especially once you got past discovery and recording and moving into sense making. And we won't get quite to acting today, but we'll be touching on recording and we'll be touching on sense making as we go through the session today. So as you're scanning, you're sort of finding individual hits. We're going to come back to that as an exercise later on, what that might look like. But what you're trying to do as you're making sense of the scanning, as you're sort of getting the sense making, is sort of look for the sort of type of changes. This is an example from Peter Bishop, who's a very distinguished futurist, who's done quite a lot of work on this area. You know, one of the things we see in Futures Awake is cycles, repeating patterns, which, you know, might be over long periods of time, might be over shorter periods of time. We see trends. Trends are typically changes in the world which can be measured, they can be understood as data. We see emerging issues. Those are sort of groups of scan hits which seem to be indicating a change in the world. And we see wildcards, which are events. We'll talk about wildcards later. They're a little bit different from other types of scan hit. But, you know, a wildcard is an event, you know, the examples there are things like the AIDS epidemic or the pandemic or the collapse of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we're also looking for here, and I should probably just add this on, is quite a lot of futures work is about patterns. There's a kind of the emerging issues example there has a very badly drawn S-curve on it. There's quite a lot of patterns of types of system change. And one of the things that one looks for when one is doing this work, when one's starting to do the sense-making part, is what sort of pattern might this be? What sort of thing is happening out there? So let me just move us on. These are the types of, I've already talked about trends a little bit, but these are the sorts of types, and I also talked about wildcards just there. So when we're starting to look at our scan hits, when we're starting to make sense of them, you know, typically we will end up sort of describing them in one of these ways. You know, a weak signal is something which is at the bit of the edge. We're not quite sure what it is yet. We're not sure whether it's going to last. We're not sure how strong it is, but it's definitely something a bit different. It's an early sign of a possible change. The trend, as I talked about, is a dynamic of change. It's something that's been changing steadily over time. A driver of change is effectively often a combination of trends and a combination of signals. It's a sort of a much more substantial change, which is sort of causing significant disruption to the external environment. And the wildcards, as I talked about a minute ago, they are unexpected or high impact events that typically they have lower probability, not necessarily. There's a lot of arguments about the extent to which you can assign probabilities in futures work at all. And let's just go on. So what you're doing when you're scanning, so this is a classic systems diagram, fried egg metaphor that we like in the corner, that the reason that you're scanning is you're trying to look outside to both your operating and task environment and how that's changing, and also to your contextual environment and how that is changing. And this is from work done in the 1960s by Emery and Trist, very influential paper about the contextual environment that actually changed one of the sort of underlying ideas in futures work, is that change comes from the outside. And then it arrives in your operating environment, then eventually it arrives in your sort of local system or your organization. And the frying pan metaphor, the idea there is that the pan heats up first, that's the contextual environment, and then the white heats up, and that's your operating environment, and then finally the yolk starts to heat up. But the yolk is the last thing that starts cooking. So when you're scanning for drivers of change, when you're scanning for trends, when you're scanning for emerging issues, what you're trying to understand are the changes in your contextual environment, because of that underlying futures idea that change comes from the outside and arrives later on in your system and your organization. And just there's some kind of useful definitions here by Adam Gordon in his very business-focused book, but a good book called Future Savvy, where he talks about trends, drivers, and also fads. He did a lot of, he's an academic now, but he did a lot of business consulting in the 1990s and the 2000s, and spent a lot of time trying to persuade businesses not to spend too much time on something that just popped up and then disappeared. So he defines a trend as being a sequential pattern in recorded data. Obviously, that data still needs to pass tests of significance. The driver is the force of change that sits behind a trend. And we're going to come back to that a little bit when we're doing some of our work later on today. And a fad is something that pops up and then disappears equally quickly. And quite often, when you see a fad for the first time, it's hard to work out whether it's a weak signal or indeed potentially a trend, or whether it's a fad. And often you have to do some sort of intelligent structural analysis about it to work out what's going on with it. Let me just, as I'm working through this material, let me just keep going for a bit. We're going to get to a little bit of a breathing space in a minute. These are the 5 principles of scanning. Take a structured approach. Keep it as simple as you can do, though not too simple. As simple as you can do, but not any simpler than that. Keep it relevant and challenging, so it should be stretching your thinking. Understand the causes and effects, and that practice matters. The more you scan, the better you get at it. Almost the less structure you need, because you'll start seeing things almost without having to go through the whole process. And let's just this is an example from a project which SURF did a few years ago for IATA, the aviation industry body. And this was the question: what are the key drivers of change that IATA should be thinking about to prepare for future opportunities and challenges over the next 20 years? And that seemed like a good point to pause and just let you sort of, again, using the chat if you want to, if you're starting to do that, what sorts of things are going to be popping into your mind as you're starting to think, well, heavens, I need to do a quick scan for the future of aviation and the future of airlines. What should I be looking at? What sort of things should I be sort of thinking are going to be in that set to get ourselves to that piece of thinking? So, as I say, just take a minute or so and just pop some things into the chat. what drives change in air flight? Exactly right, Michael. That's the question, traveling trends and behavior. Okay, so let's just get a couple more. Yeah. So we've just got a few there. Celia, this is popping, they're pouring out now. Celia talked about the energy transition away from fossil fuels, rarity and cost of fossil fuels driving the shift. Maritere has traveling trends and behavior. Louisa comes back to climate consciousness and consciousness of CO2 emissions, energy provision challenges. Yeah, those are all good. One of the things I'm going to show you the kind of list that we produced, not to spend very much time on it, but just to give you a sense of what it looked like in a moment or two. But you know, one of the things that you might also be just looking at are the profitability trends of airlines, which even before the pandemic were falling. So there's a lot of the there's some interesting in that kind of traveler behavior. There's some interesting trends that actually business travel seems to be declining in, certainly in Western markets, if not in Asian markets, partly because business people seem to want to spend more time at home. Natural disasters, they would probably be Marianne, yes, natural disasters. I think that might be a wild card. It would be an interesting question. Celia, obviously remote working, digital technologies drive change in business travel. So we'll come back to that in just a minute very quickly, but let me just talk about what you're actually starting to do when you do that. All of those things are good examples, but so some of you will have seen this idea of STEEP as a set of frameworks for starting to think about this: social, technology, economy, environment, politics. And you know, typically when you started to do this, these are useful buckets to make sure that you're picking things up in. You know, one of the things, I've actually done quite a lot of work on the future of aviation recently, and you know, one of the things you start getting into quite quickly because of the environmental issue is, you know, what's the technology looking like for non-fossil aviation fuels, for example, you know, direct air capture and stuff like that. So you start getting things in the technology space. What are the prospects for hydrogen-powered planes? That's quite a big demand question. And STEEP's quite good, but you know, it tends to leave out legal and regulatory. And a lot of people like aviation who are working in the legal and regulatory space just want it to be called out specifically as an area. We didn't actually do that for IATA. We just put the legal and regulatory stuff in the politics space. And the other interesting evolution over the last decade or so, especially from Australia as it happens, and the Pacific futurists, where values they do, there's a lot more work in the Pacific region, which drives off the back of values changes, and values changes are one of the big things which causes shifts at drivers of change at a generational level, is they actually specifically add a V for values. So you end up with a rather complicated steeple plus V sort of acronym. And some of you will have used PESTEL, I think, probably as an example. And PESTEL is obviously just that middle one there, the steeple stroke R with just rearranged in a different order. And I'm just going to, this was the, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but these were a lot of the things that came up when we did this work for IATA. So it was around 10 or 12 drivers in each of these spaces. And that's typically about the right sort of number, you know, a little bit more for a more complex system, a little bit less for a simpler system, more shorter term sort of piece of futures work. But, you know, typically if you end up with between 45 and 75 kind of drivers of change as a result of your scan, you've probably got enough. I've seen people sort of try to work with larger numbers, and it tends to create a lot of noise. So typically what you end up doing is you end up with a longer list, and then you start looking at them. You'll start seeing things which are really subcategories of bigger shifts, for example, and you'll pop those together. Sometimes you'll look at them and think, actually, that's not really strong enough to take the weight that we're trying to put on it here. And I think it's just worth also saying that steeple doesn't always work, or no matter how you describe it. Richard Lum and a futurist called Michelle Bowman developed a category called VERGE. It doesn't stand for anything. It's not an acronym, which deliberately looked at the world through a set of anthropological lenses: produce, consume, relate, connect, destroy, and define, which is about worldviews. And the reason they did this is they were doing a project which was more in the cultural space of meaning, and they just were finding that steep was just sort of too big, too flat. It was just a bunch of big sort of high-level domains, and they actually wanted a set of frameworks which they could use for actually understanding much more about human behavior and human meaning making. Don't necessarily recommend this, but if you're doing some sorts of projects, especially projects which are more around human behavior and sort of the way in which one might be looking for potential for change, this is quite an interesting way to describe the world. It's also quite a good way of building alternative scenarios as well. So I probably should just, I've just gone through quite a lot of material quite quickly there, so I should probably just pause. Yeah, Louise has just popped teleportation in as a driver of change. And I was reading an article the other day which was still quite excited about Elon Musk's idea of the Hyperloop, although I think we're probably going to wait a while for that. Just any other question? We've gone through quite a lot of stuff quite quickly there. I'm just about to move on to the next phase or the next group. I'm just wondering if you've got any quick questions or comments before we move forwards. Making sense so far? Okay, I'll press on. I'll stop off the next session if something comes to you. So one of the things that sometimes happens, especially in organizations which have got a very technical or scientific culture, is that people worry that they haven't really got enough information on their scan card, that actually it needs to be more like a briefing document. But actually, typically when you're using this work, you're actually trying to look at groups of scan cards or drivers of change or trends cards together. And actually, they're really more like a prompt. You can always put the information that you need, behind it. You can have it attached to, linked to something in your database or whatever it is. But actually, in terms of working with this material, less is more. Let me just show you the card from the aviation deck. This is a driver about environmental activism. So really, it's got sort of 3 or 4 elements on it. The references are being stored somewhere else. So it's got a little image and a question over there on the left-hand side. That's actually the other side. We actually did these cards physically. It's got a title, what the subject's about. It's got a couple of paragraphs on what the analysis is. I mean, that is something like 60 to 80 words. It's got a question at the bottom. And then over on the other side, it's got some uncertainties which are emerging from this particular behavior. This was because of the way that we ended up building the scenarios. We ended up looking for different clusters of uncertainties. It wasn't sort of straightforward 2 by 2. And then there's a little piece of evidence, a pocket of the future and the present about shareholder activists, which had come from some of the research that we're doing. I personally think this card could be improved a little bit. I'm just wondering if people have got thoughts about that. If you were going to make this card better, what would you do? Again, just pop things in the chat or just speak if you want to. Contextualize, what do you mean by that, Louise?
I mean that what's being described here is being described as something universal, although this activism may occur in one part of the world and may express itself differently in others. So it's contextualizing a little bit where this environmentalism has started or is spreading or is most prominent might be helpful.
Yeah, that might well be helpful. Absolutely. Are there other observations about it? I mean, I think I would probably, if I was redoing, I didn't work on this project, but if I was redoing this, I would probably want to have some sort of sense of the direction of travel of this. You know, clearly this is about more environmental activism rather than less. And, you know, when you start sort of looking for both causes and effects and the relationships between different cards, it's useful to have a sense of the underlying direction. And again, you know, just it's sometimes useful to be able to just distill the thing down to a 2-line summary as well. So effectively, you've got a direction of travel and 2 lines underneath that, which just says what this thing is. The other observation I've got is the way this has been designed is that it's slightly confusing one visually between the narrative and the future question. And I would probably want typographically to make that a bit of a different thing. Some groups, some organizations, some clients like to have those kinds of provocations. Some of them say, well, actually, we don't really know what those things are going to do until we start seeing how these different cards can combine at the sense-making stage. So it's actually too early to start putting questions on here. You know, equally, you know, given there's a book out there in the environmental literature since we did this project called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which isn't actually a manual on how to blow up a pipeline. It's more a philosophical book about the ethics of non-violent, violent but non-human, you know, violent protests, but not against people. You know, that may be the sort of thing that you'd be capturing on this card if you rewrote it now. I'm just going to say, actually, Johan's just put a note in the chat about this a couple of minutes ago, that we actually borrowed this design because IATA liked it from Arup, the engineering and architecture consultancy. They're based in London, but they've got a very global presence. And they actually have a list of driver cards online, which kind of covers a pretty good global view, albeit slightly leaning towards kind of urban change. So, you know, I was talking about, you know, where do you start? And, you know, using steep. One of the ways you can start is actually just start with somebody else's generic deck, and then start looking at it through the lens of your question and saying which of these are meaningful, which are not. And I'm just going to move on quickly and just also talk about a more structured way of doing this. This is from a piece of work we did for a client in the development and humanitarian space. And what we did there was we just started with a kind of this map on the top right of the sector of the system. It does look a bit like the, you know, the fried egg diagram or the systems diagram we showed you earlier. And we did a little bit of mapping of who was in those places, government bodies, international organizations, international NGOs in the sector, and then some of the other things around the edge of that and the wider system, like, you know, frontline humanitarian workers, national local aid groups. And what we then did is we looked at what those sorts of organizations had been writing recently on the future. And that then led to a thematic, as we sort of, you know, started capturing the different scan hits. And I think we ended up with about 45 of that particular case from that sort of review of the literature. I think somebody's waiting to come in, Johan, if you can just let them in. As once we started doing the clustering, we started seeing these sorts of 5 stories emerging around the scale and intensity of climate crisis, more complex future crises, sustained erosion of international norms and values, inequality getting worse, and obviously human vulnerability getting worse as well. And that's effectively going through the process. That was discovery, and then we did some classification, and then we did some sense making. And I'll come back to this a bit later on, because we also use those 5 to do some implications for the client. So I'm just going to pause there again. I've been because we have a question here. How do you map? Where are you looking for information? Sorry, let me just go back. So Michael, yes, absolutely, put a future date, especially if that's actually been included in the original material. It's sometimes quite hard to tell how quickly things are moving until you do the sense making. But sometimes in the original material, there's an assessment of how quickly something might be changing. Sometimes, especially when you're looking at it from a technology perspective, and I know you were talking about technology earlier on, Michael, some of those technological projections are, you can actually do, you can get a sort of a reasonably good idea of how far away something is from coming into, being prototyped, being reaching the stage of demonstrated, coming into first option, first use in a market. When I was looking at the future of the aviation industry, it was fairly clear that hydrogen planes, if they take off, I mean, literally if they take off, I guess, but weren't really going to be in the market in a meaningful way until the 2050s or 2060s, because it really took, the life cycle of planes is around 15 years. Most of the ones which are being bought over the next 15 years were already been paid for. It takes that long to change regulations. So effectively, you'd start seeing hydrogen planes coming into the market in the 2040s to 2050s, but probably not at volume until the 2050s. Louisa, do you want to just speak to your question?
Sure. I was referring to the example where you were working with a humanitarian organization and you mapped some patterns. I was just wondering, how did you go about the research? There's so many kinds of sources you could potentially consult. So I was wondering, in practice, how did it work with you and the team?
In practice, we were working with a researcher who had done a lot of work in the field already. So in practice, we were sort of using her existing expertise of the field, if I'm being completely honest about it. That does help. Effectively, we said to the client, we had that map, and we said to the client, and we also worked with the client, what are the things that you've seen in this area that, start resonating. I think it's also, I'm not sure how much you did on scoping last time, but it's also just worth observing that it depends on the question, that things will become in and out of scope depending on the question. I'd also just say that it's best to make sure your question is slightly wider than it should be, so you don't, it does definitely need to be about the system and not about the sector, because otherwise you end up missing the stuff that's changing at the edges. But effectively, we kind of went back with we did a very quick sort of institutional scan. We also looked quickly.
Mimi's on the roof. You let her in.
So I'm at home here, and my cat is desperate to get in through the window of the room that I'm working in. So in a minute, I'm going to turn my camera off and let my cat in. But just let me deal with this a little bit first. So effectively, what we did is we mapped some organizations. We also mapped the kind of ones that were doing the more interesting work in this area, and sort of produced a kind of list of reports. So it's kind of a bit like doing a literature review. And then we sort of looked at what was coming out of that, and then we looked at gaps, and that was the kind of process we went through. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Louisa.
Yes, it's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So what am I going to do next? I am going to talk a little bit about wildcards and shocks, and then we are going to go to an exercise. So I'm going to push on. I'm getting a little note, we're a little bit behind time. Weak signals. This is a very good article by Mikko Duffer of Sitra in Finland. Weak signal is the first indicator of change, emerging issue that might become significant. The picture here, if I remember this correctly, Marius might want to come in, is a DIY homebrew genomics kit, I think, which actually is a real thing. It did win, it was a finalist in a Technology Innovation Award. Is that right, Marius? I think I got that right.
That's correct, Andrew. It's exactly as you say. It's a sort of early signal or weak signal of an emerging, one could probably call it the democratization of genetic engineering.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So very early days, it was very much a kind of a technology competition. And so a weak signal, as Duffer says here, it's the thing, it's the signal, and it's a story about how it's being interpreted. And that's quite important, as we'll come back to when we start talking about some of those kind of interpretive frames later on. And one of the people who's done a lot of work on this, a very influential futurist called Jim Data, and his second law of the future is that any useful idea about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous. And this was from the late 1970s, he first coined this law. And his first example of this was that robots will have rights. This is a sort of from some of the work that he did with the Futures group that he ran in Hawaii. Futures, it makes your colleagues laugh, colleagues hate it, and it's never going to happen. It makes people wonder, no one's heard about it. It seems to be striking a taboo. So just again, pop in the chat. Why would you go and look for weak signals? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to let my count in. Celia is saying to get ahead of a trend, identify it as early as possible, to be prepared for the unthinkable. Both of those things are right. Very good. Stimulate conversation and creativity, challenge assumptions. That's very good. This is all good stuff. Because they can become strong trends. Exactly right. And I'll talk about some of the patterns around that later on. They can have a profound effect. They go deeper into behavioral aspects, changes in values. That's very true. Quite often weak signals are a very early indication of shifts in values, and therefore sort of quite an interesting sort of reflector. And one of the other things about weak signals, actually, I'll just mention this here before I move on, is that especially in policy terms, there are sort of now some governments which seem to be kind of earlier in policy terms than others. You know, sometimes South Korea in some aspects, New Zealand in some aspects. In the UK, where I work with the Welsh government, is a long way ahead in terms of some of its things about intergenerational fairness. Finland quite often has an early adopter of innovations. In the United States, California is typically an early adopter of new trends. So in the policy terms, you can also start looking for weak signals around what a particular governments, either nationally or regionally or at state level, starting to do. Okay. Celia, that's a great question. So let me just pick it up now. how do you distinguish a weak signal from an irrelevant fact? What actually differentiates a signal from background noise? So one of the things that I have a background in social and political sciences, and quite a strong believer in social construction, and I've actually written stuff around a lot of futures is around social process of social construction. And there's sort of a bit of, you're sort of touching here on an area, there's a bit of controversy in the future space, Celia, but because there is something in the literature says, you're looking, the weak signal, you're looking for, the equivalent of patient zero in an epidemic. I don't think that's right. I think, there's lots of people who think they have invented perpetual motion machines. And, when you go and look at them, you discover that actually they've sort of forgotten the basic point of the science here. So I think the answer is when you see something that's just out and out weird for the first time, you don't know whether it's a weak signal or an irrelevant fact. All you can do at that point is park it. So actually, and then you've noticed it. So you've noticed it, so you can start working on it. You start sort of monitoring it. And what you could, and so when you see a second one, especially if it's in a different sector or a different jurisdiction or a different social group, you say, okay, well, that's interesting. We had one of those there and one of those over here. And, you keep monitoring it. So actually, a weak signal on its own isn't worth very much. It's just something that might have happened. It could be the equivalent of the patient, the psychologically unwell person who thinks they're Napoleon. But when you start seeing groups of people in different places and different cultures and different sectors and different jurisdictions starting to do things, at that point it starts to sort of tell you something. And the other thing you can do, and we'll come back to this maybe, is you can also look at the causes of what's sitting behind it. Actually this the one that we're looking at here, the homegrown DNA test, in effect, was sort of being driven by a whole lot of cost curves and science in the home, sort of falling costs of science, which actually looked like quite deep signals of change. So when you actually start doing some analysis of the signal, you can also sort of build up some sense of its credibility as well. So that's probably what I'd be doing. I'd be both monitoring it, waiting for some more examples to appear, but I would also be diving into it and say, well, actually, what's driving this? What's causing this? Is that a fundamental change, or is that just a bit of a blip? I probably do need to move on, so let me. I think I've just gone two at a time there. Sorry. So let me just talk about shocks, predictable surprises, and wildcards. I'm going to do this quite quickly. I think you've probably all heard of a black swan, made famous by Taleb, originally developed by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Something that you didn't expect, which changes the way that you see the world. I think I'm just going to say as a futurist that a lot of things I've seen described as black swans are actually just organizational blind spots. And certainly the idea of the black swan shouldn't be an alibi for bad futures work. So if you go back to 9/11, which is often used as an example of a black swan, the previous decade is full of signs in well-known and highly visible places that something like that attack was a possibility, including the car bomb attack on the World Trade Center in the 1990s, including a succession of American government reports which said that it's not inconceivable that a group of terrorists might attempt to fly a plane into a tall building and use it as a bomb. So, often when you're actually being told something's a black swan, it's really just being used as an alibi for really shoddy work. The black jellyfish here, comes from the Post-Normal Futures group. They're quite an interesting group who sort of look at sort of unexpected futures. And they're particularly interested in how particular different signs of change interact to create unexpected events. The black jellyfish metaphor comes from the USS Reagan, which was on a visit, a big sort of public visit to Melbourne in 2006, when suddenly a vast jellyfish bloom overtook the harbour and killed the I think the condensers of the USS Reagan, the biggest naval ship in the world, and the ship had to be evacuated of passengers because actually it was completely immobilized by the jellyfish and the condensers, and they had to stop and clean them all out. So that's effectively sort of quite an interesting, it's effectively there was a climate change effect. There was a sort of an increase in the temperature, which meant there was a huge, very fast jellyfish bloom, and that overwhelmed this sort of very modern technology. And in some ways, that's kind of a more interesting analytical thing than just the black swan. Black elephants, also a creation of the Post-Normal Futures Group, are a future that's already happened. They're high impact and high probability, but for some reason, nobody is talking about them. Peter Drucker, who's obviously not a futurist, more a management academic, talked about the future already happened in a paper in the very early 1960s, where he noticed that the black incomes in the United States had doubled between 1946 and about 1960. They were still lower, much lower than the white household average. But he said when you get a change of that speed, you start seeing other effects. You start seeing new markets emerging. There's suddenly a big market for black radio during the 1950s, driven by this change in income, which is one of the reasons we had rock and roll in the 1950s. You start seeing new cultural effects, and obviously Motown sort of emerged quite shortly after he'd made this observation, and you start seeing new political effects as well, and obviously the civil rights movement, which had kind of bubbled along right through the 1950s, suddenly obviously sort of became much more mainstream in the 1960s. So and quite a lot of changes, quite a lot of trends. You can look at them and say, well, actually the effect hasn't happened yet. If you look at the refugee crisis in Europe in the mid 2010s, a lot of academics who followed refugee crises were saying, given the displacement of people, especially from Syria, but generally from the Middle East, some sort of refugee wave in Europe, much smaller than the refugee waves we'd already seen in the Middle East, obviously, is going to start sort of moving into Europe, and there's going to have political effects. And finally, let's just talk about wildcards. Alex Fernandez, a very good future scholar and worth following. His Medium account is certainly worth following. Wildcard news events, not a driving force. It's not reversible. It's impactful on human society. It's low in objective probability. But it is imaginable, and they can be both positive and negative. And I think what I just say about using wildcards is you mustn't confuse them with scan hits, and you almost need to keep them in a different place, because what you end up using them for in the process is to, when you start doing the sense making and you start getting some system or structural views of what's going on, you can use wildcards to test how that system behaves under stress or under pressure. And very quickly, last couple of slides before we go into a little bit of work. This is a classic futures S-curve. I'm going to do a bit of classification on this in a minute, but at the bottom end of the S-curve, the bottom left here, where the weak signals are, you're looking at specialist journals and websites or leading edge consumers, scientists, sometimes creatives, radical groups. As you start moving up, you start seeing laypersons, magazines, websites, documentaries, all that sort of stuff moving up again, newspapers, mainstream media. And then as you get into the kind of the mainstream, as the S-curve moves past its middle point, you get into legal disputes and government institutions and that sort of thing. I'm just going to pop a classification on there. This is the Molitor model of change. Molitor talks about policy changes going through 3 stages: framing, advancing, and resolving. I think we're going to be able to share the paper if we haven't done that already. Framing is the very early stage where there's quite a lot of competition about what this thing is, what it means, different interpretations of it. Advancing, you start getting some sort of consolidation of what its meaning is, but it's still not in mainstream policy. It's still regarded as an oppositional piece of thinking. And then by the time it gets to resolving, it's sort of starting to move into the policy mainstream. So you start seeing, government discussion papers, green papers or white papers about it. You sometimes start seeing commissions of inquiry. You sometimes start seeing legal disputes. So just to give an example of that, when you look at the legal cases which are about whether animals should have rights, which typically are generally getting lost, but not everywhere, that's a sign that we're in somewhere between advancing and resolving in that particular policy area. Okay. So Michael, let me just go back. Michael, a weak signal is different from a wildcard. A weak signal is a sign of a change. A wildcard is a possible event. Yeah, I was just going to talk about the fact that although there's an S-curve there, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen or it's going to become mainstream. So, one of the things that I have been talking about with clients since about 2003, and I certainly wasn't the first person to be talking to clients about this, was 3D printing or additive manufacturing, which, in 2003, 2004, everybody said it was going to transform the world's industrial system. We're about 20 years on from that now, and what we know is that it's a very, very good technology for very expensive, high-end bits of technology like aero engine parts that need replacing, or it's used on the International Space Station, or professional, sometimes top-end elite bike racing. But it certainly hasn't become mainstream. It's sort of still, it's a much flatter S-curve. Sorry, let me go back. Louisa, let's just pick up the S-curve question. Can you want to just come in and give me your question out loud?
I know, it's just what's the S-curve in comparison to the other one? How, if you could just pick that up again, elaborate on it.
Compared to which one? The other one? The bell-shaped curve?
Yep.
I always get this the wrong way around, but one's just the integration of the other one. So one is the rate of change, and one is the cumulative impact. So what you see on the blue curve is kind of rate of change starts slowly, picks up, it starts to accelerate, it gets to a midpoint when, it's sort of half, it's into the mainstream there, but at that point it tends to start slowing down, and then it gets slower and slower as it becomes more and more mainstream. The yellow one is really just the cumulative impact. So it sort of starts with, it starts being sort of very low prevalence early on. It gets more and more visible. So, we were talking about earlier about how did you know that a weak signal was a genuine thing and not just a kind of somebody being weird. Over there at the far left, you don't really know that, but then you start seeing other people talking about the same thing and other groups talking about the same thing, so it starts just moving up. There's a bit of systems thinking that sits behind this curve as well, which is that as something becomes more visible, it starts building connections, it starts sort of acquiring sort of credibility among certain sorts of groups, which then makes it sort of more visible. But quite often, the early stage is all really happening out of sight unless your scanning is very good, because it's happening in places that you don't really look. Whereas by the time, obviously, it gets up to being newspapers have got feature articles about it, or there's court cases about it, or the government's sort of got a policy paper about it. Clearly, that's very much in the sort of the mainstream, and it's very visible. But it's a sort of a process of accretion where something both becomes more visible and more discussed, but also more credible in the same time. And there's a little bit of theory that sits behind this, which is that at the framing stage, you do often have, multiple interpretations of what thing is going to be. Whereas by the time you get to advancing, this is similar to some of the work in the way technologies become mainstream as well. by the time you get to the advancing stage, there's a kind of coalition of sometimes one or two different coalitions that have kind of built stories about what this thing is going to do, which makes it easier to understand. So let me just give you an example of that. If I'm looking at universal basic income, that's clearly a well understood thing now, but nobody really knows how it works or why it works or whatever. It's completely contested still. It's loved by Silicon Valley billionaires as much as it's advocated by equality campaigners. So that's really still in the framing stage. It's visible. It's still just in the framing stage. It's visible, but there's a lot of competition about what it is. It pops up from time to time in newspapers and mainstream media, but not in a very sympathetic way. If I look at something like universal basic service, which is obviously a competing idea in that space, generally speaking, people have managed to construct that in such a way that there's only one view of it. It's about making sure that everybody has access as right of a citizen to a group of core services which they should be able to have, whether that's clean water, whether that's access to the internet. So the universal basic service thing is probably now in the advancing stage. It's kind of emerged from its framing argument and it's moving up. And I personally expect that we'll start seeing that, especially if inequality carries on being a strong driver of some policy discussions in some jurisdictions, that we're going to see more about universal basic service sort of moving up into that towards the resolving space. Johan, do you want to just sort of add to the comment you just made before we move on? Because I think we're about to do some work and we're a little bit behind, so we probably do need to move on.
Yes, okay. Yes, it's just about the weak signals. There's something about looking for weak signals on the fringe. These are artists, poets, movies, sci-fi ideas, or just philosophers, people we would not necessarily go to for news. But the weak signals often actually appear in the, in the creative arts. So what we would see is maybe there would be a movie about something, and then 10 years later, that becomes a thing. That people start talking about, and that moves up the S-curve. So, and also quite often the people who are the experts have their own set of assumptions they're operating around with. And so that means that they would not necessarily have a contrary assumption that will make the weak signal even possible, or put it in their frame of view. So it's sometimes good to look at the fringe, especially if you want to see and spot weak signals.
Thank you, and I think we're going to go into a little bit of work now. Marius, I think I'm handing over to you at this point.
Thank you, Andrew. Colleagues, we know that for those of you who are new at scanning and Foresight in general, some of this is very new, lots of new language. So we have a little exercise here that we'd like to do just to get you familiar with the practice. If you'd like to go to the next slide, Andrew. What we are going to do very shortly is to put you into a pairs exercise. And you'll meet a colleague in that breakout room. And during this breakout room, what we'd like you to do is to grab a copy of the PDF that we've just popped into the chat. In that PDF, we have pre-prepared some what we would call scanning hits for you, or essentially a slide with some information on it that represents a particular example arising from a scanning exercise. And what we'd like you to do in that pairs exercise is to talk to your colleagues. We're actually going to give you a little bit less time than that. It says 12 minutes on the slide, but we're going to give you 10 minutes. And what we'd like you to do is to ask yourself 3 questions. As you look at that slide with the scan hit, number 1, what steep category would you put it in? Is it about social, technological, environmental, economic, or political? Number 2, where would you place it on the S-curve? If you remember those 3 words Andrew mentioned of emerging, advancing, and resolving. So across those 3, or framing, advancing, and resolving on the S-curve, where in that curve of change would you put that particular change? And then thirdly, how would you classify the source? In other words, the person who found this information, what kind of source? Was it a journal article? Was it a press article? Was it an interview on the BBC? What's the source of that information? Now, importantly, in the PDF we've given you, you'll find all the information you'll need. You'll find the first slide there will give you the instructions. Andrew, if you'd like to go to the next slide, I'll just show them what information they're going to be seeing. Thank you. This second slide that you see in the PDF will give you the example of a scan hit or the outcome of a scan. It's a very simple one relating to a chat bot being used by a university in South Korea to engage students. And so you can read through that. And then the next slide there, you'll get a couple of slides talking to you about STEEP, what those categories are. Thank you, Andrew. And then one more slide. You've got an example of the S-curve. And so again, just to recap, spend 10 minutes, talk to your colleagues and ask yourself, where in the S-curve would you put this scanning hit? What STEEP category is it from? And what can you learn about the source of the information that was used? And so with that, Johan, if you're ready, feel free to put us into those breakout rooms and we'll see you back in 10 minutes time.
Andrew and Marius, you don't have to join. You are in a room, but it's I don't know how to take you out.
Thank you, Johan, and colleagues, we'll see you back in 10 minutes. James, I see you're still with us in the room. Do you need some support getting into the room that we put you in?
There's 4 or 5 people who don't seem to be in a room
I
yet.
see Marion as well.
Marion, Michael, Angelica.
It's fine. I'm assigning them. Some of them dropped in and out. So
Thank you,
yeah,
Johan.
it's on our own. So let me just quickly send her to room 3. There we go. Okay, I think everybody's accounted for.
I see James is still with us here in our room. James.
James is with Marion in 10. If he is here.
Alternatively, what we might do is just move Marion to
I'm
meet
just gonna
with
put her
Silja, who I see is.
I'm gonna put Marion into just 8. There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
So how do we
Coming back in 50 seconds. Welcome back, colleagues. We'll give it a second or two for others to come back in, I think, 20 seconds or so. How was that experience, Luisa? Any thoughts so far? Mariette?
I think it was a very good experience. Good to, brainstorm with the colleagues and nice to have an actual case study to apply. Yeah.
Wonderful to hear. And so for some of you, that will be the first time working with a scan hit. Silja, any thoughts from you on what that exercise was like as we wait for others to come back in?
Yeah, similarly, interesting to do some application of what we've been learning. I think we'll have to see whether we were right, but Michael and I didn't seem to have too much trouble with the questions. It was somewhat, at least, somewhat easy for us to identify how this could be categorized. But let's see if we were right.
If I stay with you for a second, it is an interesting scan hit because it covers sort of technology, AI, within an educational context. What were your thoughts on STEEP categorization?
Yes, I mean, I think we identified it being both part of a technology type of category as well as social, because it concerns interactions between people, and we added as well values, because people's relationship to technology is very dependent on the value system in which they are, and is very different between generations. For example, people from my generation seem to have a lot more trouble trusting technology than people from my kids' generation, for example. So I think those were the 3 that were most relevant, that we felt were most relevant.
That's amazingly quality conversation for the short period of time you had. I'm really impressed by that. You're a natural scanner, it would seem. Louisa, if I could come back to you, if that's okay. Thoughts on where that sat in the S curve? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we were discussing a lot back and forth if it was a very new phenomenon because it's still not widely used, or if it's actually something that is slightly used and it's almost like going on to the resolving pillar. So we put it in between because we thought that it's already there, like it exists already, and that it might grow from there. Yeah.
So that's an interesting one, because if we look at it from as a new technology that's not widely used in all universities, it's somewhat of a framing emerging kind of issue. But if we look at it from a policy point of view, so for instance, does the national regulator for educational institutions have a policy on how to regulate chatbots within the educational context? It might be very, very far from being resolved. And so different individuals, depending on the context, may see that at being at a different stage of that curve. But that's interesting that you were having that debate. Anyone else that would like to share in the chat or by unmuting? What did you find challenging or interesting about that experience? Michael.
It was interesting. It was good. Celia and myself, we were not quite sure how much this is being used. We thought it was very early stage at the framing, very beginning. We've run into a bit of the chat, the bots before, but not for moderating a discussion, just for giving information, as far as we know. Celia thought it was more widely used maybe than we know, but as far as I know, it's not very widely used, only by companies selling products, you know, for informational purposes. But we don't even know. It just shows the thing is not regulated, so we don't even know what's going on.
I think that's a great point, actually, Michael. Let me just come in on
Go
that,
ahead, Andrew.
Marius, if I might, because we're going to come down to kind of scanning questions in a minute in our next little block of learning before we do something, the other bit of Pez work. But one of the questions that you ask is this new? And actually, when you start doing this at a more sophisticated level, there's a sort of second question there, which is this objectively new, or is this just new to you? So is it something that's actually a genuinely emerging weak signal, or is it actually a blind spot that you hadn't noticed before? And just so hearing this kind of honest conversation between you and Celia, which says, actually, we just didn't know, is kind of one of the things you do when you're scanning, say, okay, we've seen this, we hadn't seen this before, we just don't know. So let's just keep monitoring, maybe even going and do a little directed research to see how widespread it is. And then we can establish whether it is genuinely something completely new, so it's still way down at the framing end, or whether actually we just have missed it and it's actually much more common than we thought. So probably it's sort of in the advancing area instead. Until you get that information, you don't really know. So sometimes when you have this conversation, it's kind of a little sort of research agenda conversation. We need to do a bit more research to get this to work.
I think one of the elements that led us to consider that it was probably more in the earlier stages, certainly of the policymaking curve, was we felt that, I mean, that the way the source was titled was more akin to an academic type source, a sort of a specialist publication, which would signal to us that this is still relatively confidential, or at least reserved to a relatively small group of specialists, and not kind of widespread across media. There.
No, sorry, I cut across you there. And I think when you click on the link, it takes you to GitHub, which is a pretty geeky place to go. So it's a bit unclear as whether it's kind of early stage technologists or whether it's activists as well. So that would also take me to earlier rather than middle, if I'm just looking at it from that point of view, if that makes sense. Marius, I'm just thinking we should probably move on if we're going to hit our timings.
Sounds good.
So perhaps I will just share again. let me just play from the current slide. We've just done that bit. So let's just talk a little bit about, I'm just going to do about, quite quickly, I'm just going to move through some slides which are around some of the sense-making aspects. Let's just imagine, so this is about understanding effects. The reason there's a pool ball here is that, you know, often this is a bit of a kind of Newtonian sort of model where we try and work out what's causing things, what effects are causing what narratives are emerging as a result. So let's just imagine that let's just imagine that you've got a set of scan hits here rather than just one. So just very quickly in the chat, what are you going to be doing with these now? You know, let's imagine you've gone out, you've done a whole lot of research in this area, whether it's about technology or whether it's about freedom of speech, whatever it is. You've done a whole lot of research. What are you going to do next? Let me just try and make sure I can actually see the chat, which is at the moment a little bit lost. Now, this isn't a trick question. I mean, you know, we're going back to where we started today, the kind of the cycle, the scanning cycle that we showed you right early on. You're going to try and find patterns and trends. That's exactly right. Absolutely. And other, why are we going to try and find patterns and trends? Make sense of the collected data. That's exactly right. That's exactly on the money. Let's just so let's just go and sorry, I've got my screen all over the place. It's not helping me very much. Maybe have a series of conversations based on the cards you mentioned earlier. Make sense of what you found. Make meaning for inviting different voices. That's all very good as well. Let me just sorry, my. So really, I just talked about this. When you're scanning, you're asking three questions. Does this confirm something we already know? Does this change something we already know? Is this something new? Obviously, if it confirms something you already know, that's still a finding, but you don't necessarily need to spend that much time on it. It's just, you know, it's sort of whatever the existing trend is, whatever existing driver is, we know a bit more about that. If it changes something we already know, that's kind of interesting. You know, that means something is going on that may cause a change that we possibly don't fully understand. Is this something new? And as I said, when you're asking the is something new question, is this new to you or is this new to everybody? And generally, this is just our caution, you know, there's a lot of emphasis in the futures literature about importance and impact. And actually, we think that tends to get in the way of good scanning. You know, you can come back to that later on when you've done a bit more analysis. So let's just stay with the one that we've just been talking about. One of the first things that helps to do is just a little bit of mapping, really. What causes this and what effects does it have? So here's our chat bot. Just spend a minute, just pop some things in the chat and we will pick them up in just to see what's going on. What's causing this chatbot? What effects is this chatbot likely to have? That's an effect, less polarization. That's very good. Thank you, Chantal. What are the causes? It's cheap, yeah. Falling costs. AI and machine learning getting more capable, getting cheaper, possibly up to a point. What are the social causes? More trust in technology. Need for more respectful and constructive exchanges. Yes, absolutely. So one of the social causes is the completely unhelpful behavior that goes on in online spaces. And there's a whole lot of material around there, which is around why that happens, why people behave in online spaces in ways that they wouldn't dream of behaving in a kind of a person-to-person social exchange. People may trust algorithms more than they trust people in a kind of, possibly that's linked to the polarized one. So I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but I was just really trying to, quite quickly you start getting to some sort of example here. And this maybe goes back to Louisa's question in the chat about what you might do with this. And she's talking about some sort of workshop where you use your scan hits and you start to do them. I'm going to come back to that because I mean, that's exactly right. That's a really good way of working. And we're going to just show you some very crude examples of that in a minute. So we did that. So this is just the last bit here, which is just practice matters. The more scanning you do, the more you see. I talked about that at the beginning. So be curious about change, stretch your sources. And by that, I mean, when you see somebody talking about somebody else in something you're reading, go and have a look at the somebody else as well. Even if anomalies and outliers and curiosities seem really weird, do sort of embrace them, do try to understand them. Loosely held views, what if questions help. Sometimes you can use tools that make you think differently. I think probably we'll talk about that a bit more on the teamwork. I think it's on Wednesday or Thursday. Patterns are easier to identify than timescales. And just as a general rule, never say that will never happen. That's just sort of iron law of futures, really. And some of that's to do with setting up your sources, sort of making sure that you are deliberately looking at sources that are interested in emerging areas of change, thinking about speeds of change, patterns of change, dynamics of change, using your existing work to identify new ideas for research. And we just had a conversation about that as we were talking about the scan hit we had, and also actually reach out to people that you want to talk to. This diagram here comes from a report that I was the lead author of for the British Cabinet Office in the early 2000s, where we were sort of trying to define the relationship between a futures team and the organization, that effectively it was a bit like a satellite going around the organization, because you needed to be able to look into the organization to make sure you weren't doing stuff that was just too damn weird for them. But you're also able to look out and make sure you're talking to the right sorts of people, dissidents, think tanks, and so on. And that kind of mapping that we talked about earlier is part of that process. So I'm just going to show a few examples of organizing work. So a lot of the process of categorization and recording is basically so you can find the hits you need later on, whether that's everything new that's in technology in 2021, or everything that's sort of being tagged with both technology and politics, over a time period, everything that's in framing and not advancing. There's those sorts of things. You're sort of effectively filtering your database to get at things that you think are going to be helpful to you. This is an example from a project where we were looking at the things where people disagreed most on, where therefore it was a kind of a measure of uncertainty in terms of expert opinion, the things with the circles around them, where the things where expert opinion was most divergent. That's actually quite an interesting frame for this kind of work. This is much more mundane. This was a piece of work we did on the future of intellectual property for a British organization. And the sorts of things which are coming up there are on the left-hand side, the things around sort of the dominance of large organizations and intellectual property. Some questions about the ability of technology to make its own intellectual property? You know, can AIs be authors? Can they be inventors? A bit around a different social contract around intellectual property, in the sense that the rewards would become a bit one-sided and the social benefit was being lost. And over on the right-hand side there, because this was an exercise which was deliberately to get them to think about their blind spots, we were picking up the blind spots separately. So, you know, this kind of mapping, which again, Louisa, effectively, this is the sort of output you might get from that kind of mapping conversation that Louisa was suggesting. It all works really well. And effectively, sooner or later, you are going to do some sort of visual sense making with your material, I suspect. It tends to work better. And just going back to, before I pass back to Marius to take us through the next exercise, going back to the piece of work we did with the Humanitarian and Development Organization, which was also interested in journalism, we had those 5 sort of, you know, landscape themes, you know, scale of intensity of climate crisis, more complex future crises, sustained erosion of norms, inequality worsening, more vulnerability. And that actually sort of, when we started looking at that with them through what that meant for them, it sort of pulled up these three themes around a more decentralized humanitarian system, more pressure for more decolonization, more participatory spaces and different sorts of power relationships there, and increasing expectations that journalism was no longer neutral. It was supposed to help things for good. So, you know, effectively that was the second order analysis we did, having done the initial clustering and got to those 5 landscape themes. So, you know, sooner or later, this is the kind of conversation you're going to go through. And I think now I'm going to hand back to Marius to take us into the next set of work.
Thank you, Andrew, and please excuse my dog in the background. He's lively and interested in the neighbors, I think, at the moment. So to start us off, typically when we do this kind of work, we obviously would have a specific focus for our work, and we would very often have a client or a commissioning person who's commissioned the work. And so for the purpose of this exercise and going forward in the program, we're giving you what we call a live challenge. Now, the challenge is really, the only purpose of it is to focus the mind, is to give us something tangible to focus on when we're doing the scanning. And we'll use this challenge a few times for various methods across the program going forward. And the challenge is around the future of multilateralism and global governance. So for those in the multilateral environment, what is the future of multilateralism? For those looking at it more from a government, public sector point of view, as a member state, for instance, participating in multilateralism, you might say, well, it's more a question of what's the future of global governance that we then participate in. And so within the context of that, we know multilateralism and global governance is changing. We know democracies are grappling with the pressures of new forms of engagement on social media, new trends in populism, strains on the social fabric, all kinds of contextual change. And we know that the UN in particular feels these changes, even while it's grappling with questions of climate change, social inequality, global power shifts, and it's trying to make sense of these while implementing its common agenda. And so with this as background, if you were doing a foresight project for the UN or as the UN, and you were wondering about the future of multilateralism, how would you go about doing the sub-scanning for that? And so if you want to go to the next slide, Andrew, what we're going to ask you to do in the next 20 minutes is to exercise or practice your scanning skills a little bit. Important, as you're doing that, think about, does this confirm something we already know? In other words, it's a confirming hit. Does it change something we know? Is there a new form of governance emerging? Or is this something completely new? By way of example, is there an AI chatbot equivalent of global governance? If we can go to the next slide. So what we're going to ask you to do in the 20 minutes we give you is to focus on this challenge, the future of global governance and multilateralism. Work together in your pair. We're going to put you again into a pair breakout and search online for one scan hit that you think might relate to this theme. In other words, recreate the kind of slide which we just gave you, we just shared with you. using any of the STEEP categories. It could be social, technological, environmental, economic, or political, and to share something that recently attracted your attention because it was novel. And so for you and your colleague, you might do this, both of you concurrently searching the web. What can you find in 20 minutes, and write up briefly in 20 minutes that you think is interesting. And then when we come back from that, what we'll do is we'll gather those inputs in Miro. And so we're going to be sharing a Miro link where you can write your title description for that scan hit on one of the empty stickies, and you'll see in the Miro, which I'll show you an example of briefly. If we have that next slide, I think it's got an example of the Miro. You'll notice that the Miro, maybe one more. Oh, I don't think we have that slide visible. There we are. And so in the Miro, what you'll find is there's a space for social, technological, economic, environmental, or political. And what we'd like you to do, once you've found a scan hit, go ahead and grab one of those yellow stickies and move it across into the STEEP category that is relevant, and give us a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what you found that is interesting. And so with that, I don't think we have any questions. If you do have a question, hang around for a minute or two and we'll clarify for you. If not, Johan, I think we're ready to go into our groups.
Marius,
go ahead,
so I'm just going to say 2 things very quickly. One is we'll have 15 minutes and not 20, just looking at the timing. The other is, if you find 2 hits, do them both. You don't have to fight, you don't have to say which one's best. You might well find 2 or 3, that's fine too. But just, the minimum, the minimum performance here is find a scan hit. Don't need to do more than that. But if you find 2 or 3, please, which you might well do, just, do them both if you want to.
Thank you, Andrew. And so, colleagues, you'll see in the chat, the slides are available, the PDF to remind you of the instructions, and a link to the Miro if you'd like to go there in the meantime. And we'll see you back in 15 minutes. Johan, just one observation. When I opened the Miro, it took me immediately to a very highly zoomed view of Miro, which can be disconcerting for someone who's not very familiar with the platform. I don't know if there is a way to frame it. I know sometimes you can do that. You're muted, Johan.
Well, I'm perfectly lip synced with Marius's dog, which is even weirder.
What does it mean when you say highly zoomed? Do you see much more than just the? Let me quickly just share, because that'll. Oh, let's stop recording as well.
Welcome back, colleagues. We've had some fun watching some of the activity happening in Miro. Angelica, I wonder if I could come to your breakout group and ask a question. Were you able to gather some scan hits? What were your experiences?
I think Angelica's still in the room.
Angelica might be struggling to find her mute button. We'll come back to her if that's okay.
Hi.
Please go ahead. Hi.
Hi, good morning. But Maritere, could you help me, please? Making the explanation of what I found. Thank you.
Trying to write it in video, but somebody's on my sticky note, so I cannot. But, we are both from Latin America. I'm from Costa Rica, and Angelica is from Colombia. So we were trying to look a little bit what's happening in the region in order to help us directly find something. And what we were discussing was the polarization in the elections, in the populism rise in Latin America. And we discovered a hit from a think tank, a research center, talking about that. And it's something that we've been seen, so it's not that new. We were discussing that it's not something that new, but the novelty is that it's basically the whole region that is being affected by this phenomenon, so the magnitude of it. I think that was the novelty that we found in it.
Thank you, Maritere, and Angelica, thank you. That's excellent work, and that's very interesting for a number of reasons. One is the fact that you took a regional perspective, which of course demonstrates the benefit of having a diverse sensing network, but also your very interesting observation that the regional phenomena is the novelty as opposed to the singular event. Fascinating, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that in the days and weeks to come. Who else would like to share? Luisa, Silja, anyone else had an interesting scan hit that you'd like to talk about?
Marius, I'd love to know more about this hit about transnational feminist movements. That sounds really interesting.
Okay, well, that was me. But obviously it's due to the fact that I'm reading a lot about it. So as I realized that putting future of multilateralism in general is not going to yield particularly interesting results, I was then looking more for stuff I already read a lot about is shaping that theme. And there I found an academic article, but I didn't want to share because I'm aware that it's a biased search.
Yeah, but I think there's
sorry,
I was going to say it's a biased search for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a biased search for everybody. So, you know, there's something there. I'm sorry, I cut across you there, Marius. She was probably about to say exactly the same thing. I think that just underlines the importance of getting diverse voices in the group, because it means that you're getting, you know, whatever is center of gravity for one person is something new for somebody else. So, sorry, Marius, I cut across you. I was getting excited.
Not at all. I think it's a good comment, Andrew. The one thing I would add, Luisa, this is inevitable, this element of bias, but becoming self-aware about the bias and then being intentional to say, how would someone of a different geographic, political, social persuasion be looking at this question? Strengthens the scanning exercise, but thank you for sharing that. Colleagues, we are on the hour and it's been a really packed session with lots of interesting information. A couple of housekeeping points from me. We have a review session coming up later this week. I think it's on Wednesday for a few minutes. We look forward to having all of our other participants on the journey on the day, and hopefully they would have caught up by watching the recording. At that review session, we'll do more of this kind of work, as well as looking back at some of the key concepts that we covered. And so thank you for being with us today. Let me say a particular thank you to Andrew for delivering the content and giving such great explanation based on your experience. We appreciate that, and we hope to have you back on the program. If you'd like to help me to thank Andrew, give him a thumbs up or a clap or a thank you very much for laying that foundation. And then to Johan, thanks again for supporting on the back end. Great to see all of you, and we look forward to seeing you later this week.
And we are here for a few minutes if you have particular questions, because we realize you've ended this slightly quickly. So
thank you, Andrew. And just a reminder also, the Q&A in house space is open, and Andrew, myself, and other faculty will monitor that. If you have questions, see you again soon.
And Elisa, we will send you a message about anything you need to do to substitute the fact you can't make the next session. Just look at your comments in the chat. We'll send you, we'll send you a message in house space.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the session. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you, Andrew.
Pleasure. Enjoyed it. Nice to meet you.
Pity that we didn't have time for Celia, because she found a very interesting headline. Confirmed breakdown in multilateralism, the UN system, Russia kicked out of the Human Rights Council, whether you agree or disagree, but we don't want to talk to people, we just get rid of them now. So
yeah,
but it is very bad, but
and well, you know, and if you look back to before the war.